Joining us now on the line from Miami Beach, Florida, Susan Kaufman Purcell, and she comes to us via the University of Miami and the Council on Foreign Relations. Susan, it's good to have you on the program again. How are you tonight?
Very well, thank you. And you?
Just great, thank you. I want to start our conversation by reading something that Foreign Affairs published 4 years ago, but may actually have a great deal of currency still today. So let me read this excerpt and then we'll talk. Relations between the United States and Latin America today are at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. Many observers in the 1980s had hoped that Latin America's turn toward democracy and market economies, coupled with Washington's waning emphasis on security matters, would lead to closer and more cooperative ties. After 9/11, Washington effectively lost interest in Latin America. Since then, the attention the United States has paid to the region has been sporadic and narrowly targeted at particularly troubling or urgent situations. Throughout the region, support for Washington's policies has diminished. Few Latin Americans in or out of government, consider the United States to be a dependable partner. Okay, how much has changed in the 4 years since that piece was written?
Well, actually, the administration in Washington has changed, and actually I don't agree with a lot of what that article said about the United States not paying attention to Latin America 4 years ago. A lot of the anger at the United States during that period stemmed from the Iraq War, and that's why there was just fury at George Bush, and Latin America didn't really want much to do with the United States on the one hand. On the other hand, they wanted the United States to pay more attention to them. And they perceived that the United States wasn't, even though under George Bush we signed more free trade agreements than just about any other time, and the president made more visits to Latin America than any other time. Now, Latin America was very happy when President Obama was elected, because Latin America's political center of gravity is really left of center and a little left of ours, or clearly during a Republican administration. And they had high expectations that with President Obama, the relationship would be much, much better. President Obama talked about engaging the leaders of the region and treating them as equals, all the things that Latin Americans have always liked to hear or wanted to hear. But there were a number of incidences that occurred where the Latins realized that it doesn't make that much difference to change who's president of the United States or to change from one party to the other, because the United States is a global power. And so it cannot give the kind of attention to Latin America, especially when there are global security threats, as there have been since 9/11 and as there were during the Cold War. The U.S. cannot give Latin America priority, except in those cases like Colombia under George Bush and now Mexico under President Obama. And so in a way, it's in some ways it's not that different, and in fact, in some ways it may even be worse, because free trade agreements are stalled, although there's no doubt that the Latin Americans like President Obama much, much more than they like George W. Bush, at least the masses of the people who are able to identify with President Obama more, because he's not white, and most of the people in Latin America are not white. And he has a kind of connection and link with the third world, because he spent a number of years growing up in Indonesia.
Well, let's go through. I'm going to hold off on free trade for a moment here, and I want to go through some of the other things that have been in the news lately, and you can tell me about how they've affected things. Last month, the Secretary of State in the United States, Hillary Clinton, tried to get Brazil's support for sanctions against Iran because of that country's alleged nuclear program. She didn't succeed. Why didn't she succeed?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's an alleged nuclear program.
Well, it's an alleged nuclear weapons program. It's certainly a nuclear program, but it's an alleged nuclear weapons program. Fair enough.
Right. I think that that Secretary Clinton didn't succeed because Brazil has a different agenda and does not have the U.S.'s desire to distance itself from Iran. First of all, Brazilian trade with Iran is skyrocketing, and that's part of Brazil's game plan. And second of all, Brazil, I think there's a lot of evidence that Brazil, or at least some Brazilians in high up places, including I think it's the vice president, have said that Brazil wants its own nuclear weapons plan, or the ability to make or have a nuclear capability if it wants, And as a result, Brazil doesn't want to side with the United States in allowing the United States to decide which developing countries can have nuclear weapons and which ones can't. And that, to a very large extent, I think, those two things explain Brazil's policy toward Iran, and some of it actually is found to be quite reprehensible even by many Brazilians. The extent to which President Lula embraced Ahmadinejad, the extent to which Lula came out and compared the student protesters to criminals. I mean, this is a president that part of his whole background involved fighting for democracy and human rights, and now he doesn't seem to care.
Brazil's a very big country. Let's do a very small country. Honduras. Mixed signals, I think we can say, on Honduras. First, the Obama administration called for the reinstatement of the president, Manuel Zelaya, who was ousted by a military coup, and then they accepted the newly elected government, and now they've quietly dropped the matter. What's happening there?
Well, first of all, the initial policy represented a rush to judgment on the part of the Obama administration, a judgment that I think was erroneous. Immediately, they classified what happened in Honduras as a traditional military coup, but it was not a traditional military coup. Both the Supreme Court and the Congress asked for the removal of President Zelaya. Where the military stepped over the line was they boarded him onto a plane and made him leave the country. That's what turned the whole thing in a very bad direction. But actually, the reason that the legislature and the court acted was because for many months, President Zelaya had been following President Chavez's game plan of trying to mobilize people to win support, to use the democratic rules of the game to destroy democratic institutions in Honduras. Now, what happened with the United States is that the United States initially, whoever was advising them said, oh, it's a traditional military coup. And as I understand, it was not someone who was a great expert on Latin America or on Latin American coups. But the other issue was that Latin America was very united against what had happened in Honduras. And Latin America, having suffered from under military rule, was very adamant in claiming this was a military coup. And the United States, had supported multilateralism and engagement with Latin America, was sort of happy to be on the same side as the Latins, and that would win support for the United States and maybe even some affection. Well, what happened was there was an uproar in the U.S. Congress and a lot of the think tanks, et cetera, where as people looked at the situation in Honduras, they said, what's the United States doing on the same side with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela? This is ridiculous. And they pointed out that it was not a traditional military coup, and then, as they say, Hillary Clinton walked the cat back, which did not please the Latins at all. Brazil was way out on a limb on this one because they agreed to give sanctuary to the deposed president. And now I think both the United States and many of the Latin American countries are trying to find a way to get beyond this and reincorporate Honduras into, as a member of good standing in the OAS. Several countries have already recognized the new government of President Lobo, who was elected in a free and fair election he was chosen actually before this all happened, was elected by wide margins. And so they're trying to figure out how to get from where they were to where they'd like to be, which is having Honduras part of the system and maybe examining, this is the OAS now I'm talking about and its Latin American members, how they decide what kinds of political actions are legitimate and not. I mean, where was the OAS when all this was going on? They have a democratic charter. And what's so interesting is that a very short time before this, this alleged Honduran coup, which they're opposing because it undermined democracy, they voted overwhelmingly to readmit Cuba as an active member of the OAS. Now, this is a country that hasn't had a presidential election in over 50 years, so the hypocrisy was mind-boggling.
I should just ask you parenthetically, because you dropped a little line there in the midst of that answer. I'm not sure who they consulted on this, the administration. Have they ever consulted with you, or anybody inside that administration ever called you for your views on this region?
Well, not specifically called me. I write a lot. They're aware of my views, and I guess they would have a sense of how I would think on matters. No, they mainly consulted, I think, their internal legal advisors. The academic and the think tank community in the United States was not united on this at all. The more conservative members ended up really attacking the idea that this was a traditional military coup and asked, you know, look where this position leads you, to having Hugo Chavez praise the U.S. position, whereas the more liberal members tended to, for the most part, agree with the administration's position and thought that if we didn't call it a coup and didn't regard it as a coup, this was tantamount sort of to the camel's nose under the tent, or the slippery slope, or whatever reference you want to make. You know, you allow this and suddenly you're sending a signal, they thought, that now the United States will tolerate military overthrows of democratic regimes. The big problem is that the U.S. administration has not figured out yet how to deal with the threat to democracy posed by Hugo Chavez and his allies, the Cubans, etc.
Do you think, some old George W. Bush hands that are still in the bowels of the State Department calling the shots?
Oh, absolutely not, no. The Obama administration is calling the shots.
They've cleaned all them out, okay.
Put in. Yeah.
Okay, let's do...
They're not in anymore.
Let's do issue number 3 here, and this one isn't even happening in Latin America, so to speak. It's actually happening in the United States, but it's having a huge impact, one would think, on Latin America, and that is Arizona's new immigration law. How has this contributed to what could be described as a climate of mistrust between the U.S. and Latin America?
Well, it's had an unfortunate result in that it immediately was classified as, you know, how can I put it, as racially discriminatory, you know, against Latins, etc. Now, what's interesting, the first version maybe went a little bit too much in that direction. It was then modified. But the fascinating thing here is that in the last couple of weeks, a lot of the top administration people, starting with Eric Holder, who's the Attorney General, and Janet Napolitano, who's the head of Homeland Security, after they had spent, I don't know how many interviews condemning this law, actually, a congressman and various news people started asking them, have you read the law? And would you believe it that they formed these positions and claimed that they hadn't even read the law? I mean, this is an outrage.
But they got people who read it for them, presumably, don't they?
Well, no, they refused to answer questions on it because they said they hadn't read it. Therefore, they weren't in a position to comment on the law. I mean, it was a joke. But in any case, the problem is, this is a state, Arizona, which has been besieged by illegal immigrants, in part because the wall, you know, walled off California, so naturally wherever the wall stopped, the immigrants started crossing the border. And the Arizonans feel that this has made them, you know, this has caused, Phoenix is now supposedly the kidnapping capital of the United States, if not even more. There's been a lot of violent crime, and in many cases, but not all, and I don't have the numbers and I haven't seen the numbers, illegal immigrants have been implicated in at least some of them. So Arizona has been painted as anti-immigrant because of this legislation. And I think that the media have, not all the media obviously, have willfully refused to distinguish between a position on legal immigration and a position regarding illegal immigration. This law only concerns illegal immigration. And it's very touchy. I don't even know if you're able to implement it. It's probably going to go to the courts, and we shall see. But I think a lot of the problem is people haven't read the law, and people refuse to distinguish between illegal and legal immigration. They're called undocumented immigrants. They're called, I don't know, something else. But they're never called in terms of what the issue is, which is illegal. They are not in the United States legally, and they therefore, it's justifiable to have a different position with regard to illegal immigration versus people who've waited their term, waited their time, gone through all of the steps they're supposed to, and have become legal immigrants. Now, one last thing on this issue, I mean, there's a lot you can say on the issue. The United States government is also to blame, Washington, because we need immigration reform, and particularly we need to make sure that the immigration part of the government works efficiently. The backlog is huge, the waiting time is huge, And so we're not going to get any, you know, there's no argument if you say to illegal people, you should enter legally, and then suppose the people who want to enter say, but we would like to, but you know, it takes too long, it's impossible to get in that way.
I appreciate all that. I appreciate all that, but I'm wondering, from the perch of a Latin American looking north and seeing the state of Arizona implementing that kind of a law, regardless of what side of the issue on, regardless of what you think it does or doesn't do in terms of racial profiling, does that just give people in Latin America another reason to look at the United States with disdain?
Possibly, but here President Calderon not contradicted, criticized the United States in his speech before Congress, and saying, you know, taking issue with these draconian laws. And then some people did research on how what Mexican laws are on illegal immigration, and they're tougher.
Let me pick up on Mexico then, because I guess it's almost 20 years since the North American Free Trade Agreement was put in place. And, well, more than 20 years, I guess. When was that? Or 93, I guess. Almost 20 years.
Yeah, well, it was I guess it took effect January 94.
Yeah. That seemed to be an indication of the two hemispheres getting closer together. And then we saw the peso crisis of 1994 as well, where the United States certainly stepped in and helped Mexico secure its own currency. And I guess many people thought that those two things in particular should have been the dawn of much improved relations between the North and the South, between the United States and Mexico. Pick the two sides that you want. Doesn't seem to have been the case. Why not?
Well, I think the relationship between the United States and Mexico is pretty decent. We have a new Plan Merida to help them with the crime and drug problems. The immigration issue, it's an interesting and complicated issue from the Mexican side. You know, Mexico gets a lot of money by having illegal Mexicans in the United States illegally. It is one of the top two, I think, sources of Mexico's foreign exchange, or it was before the U.S. recession, because now a lot of the people in the United States illegally are out of work. So Mexico gets rid of people that, if they had to stay in Mexico and couldn't earn any money, could contribute to a kind of pressure cooker environment in Mexico. So it's a safety valve for Mexico to have these people be able to leave. And at the same time, it's a huge source of money. And then you got the drug cartels, which actually are responsible for, you know, several $1 billion entering, or more than several, I don't know the exact figure, entering Mexico illegally. Whether the trade-off between getting all this money into Mexico and having all this horrendous violence, I mean, in the last several years, 23,000 Mexicans have been killed. And that exceeds the death toll in the Iraq War. So, I mean, this is a horrendous situation in Mexico. But Mexico has losses and gains as a result of the cartels and the illegal immigrants.
Let me move on and read you something that was reported in Newsweek last summer. If one-time left-wingers are in charge in a dozen Central and South American states, most remain leftists in name only. In part, this is because Latin America voters are changing. Despite the financial meltdown and for all the lather over neoliberalism, young Latin Americans are still in favor of free market capitalism. In a Poder-Zogby poll commissioned earlier this year by Newsweek, 63% of Latin Americans ages 18 to 29 say that they believe that free trade is not only good, but, quote, benefits all people. The same number saw Colombia's FARC guerrillas as terrorists or drug traffickers, and 2/3 named Chavez as the leader worst suited to lead the region in the future. That doesn't mean that Latin America is veering right again, but it just may be learning to cherish the middle ground. Okay, a couple of things emerging out of that. Number one, first and foremost, agree or disagree with those thoughts?
I totally agree.
You totally agree. Okay, in which case, where do you want to put Latin America? I know you said earlier in our discussion that you tended to think of the people as being sort of more towards the left wing of the spectrum, but those results certainly don't suggest that, so where would you put them?
No, I didn't say left wing. I said their political center of gravity is somewhat to the left of the United States, but it's still the center. It's not the left. It's
okay,
just,
gotcha.
They're more social they're more social democratic. I didn't mean they were guerrillas or crazy Marxists or anything like that. The reason that they've moved more toward the center from the extremes. Even those governments that are governed by people who in the past were quite far on the left and even served as guerrillas in some cases, is because they've gone through some horrible times where they've had one economic crisis after the other. Everybody's savings, their jobs, et cetera, wiped out. And so they learned from experience that those kinds of policies, or the Cuban model, or whatever you want to call it, don't bring prosperity. So they, as a result of these kind of meltdowns that they kept having, various Latin American governments started implementing more responsible and centrist and market-based kinds of macroeconomic policies. And so to Lula's credit, when he took over from President Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who is a social democrat and who actually adopted these policies, Lula decided to keep them, despite the fact in his youth, he was a Marxist labor leader. But so Lula kept them, and also Brazil, the region, South America in particular, has benefited greatly from the commodities boom recently that has been spurred by this seemingly insatiable Chinese demand for food and minerals and oil, et cetera. So the countries have seen that they've been able to benefit from their increased involvement in the global economy, from the commodities boom, from having stable macroeconomic policies, which include keeping a lid on inflation. At the same time that these formerly leftist presidents have implemented these more centrist policies, they have also done some really good things in terms of social welfare policies, especially in Brazil and Mexico. They have programs that have really raised large numbers of poor people into the middle class. And so you ask, how come these people are being elected, formerly left of center people, but the policies seem more centrist, and part of it is that the old leftists, many of them now are the new middle class in Latin America, and they've got a stake in the system, in the economy, in the political system. So that helps explain why you have former leftists being rewarded and elected by countries that in the past were more to the left than they are today in terms of their political beliefs.
Well, if I'm hearing you correctly, and if I'm reading between the lines properly, it sounds like you think the United States has relatively good relationships with Mexico and Colombia and Peru and the new government in Chile. And I think it's fair to say that those are all, center-right governments, in which case, how do other countries in Latin America view those relationships?
Well, I think the United States has more good relationships. I mean, basically, its relationship with Brazil is not horrible by a long stretch. I mean, they have important disagreements on foreign policy, which we've already talked a little bit about. But in their trade relationship, et cetera, there are some decent relationships. And the other left of center governments, well, Argentina is a difficult case, and it's hard to even classify it as left or right. It's a little erratic. That's part of the problem with the Argentine government. But even with countries like Paraguay, which has a leftist president, El Salvador, which has a leftist president, and we even get along in some cases with Ortega in Nicaragua, who is also a problematic president. I mean, the issue with the United States and Latin America now, many people think the United States is against leftist governments. I don't think it is, and I don't think that's the dividing line anymore. It's not a left-right thing. The really important distinction now for the United States, and maybe even for more and more Latin Americans, are democratic governments who behave democratically versus, democratically elected governments who behave democratically versus democratically elected presidents who behave in an increasingly authoritarian ways by using the democratic rules of the game to destroy democracy.
I see. Is there one country, though,
is
there one country in Latin America you'd point to as saying, boy, they're really simpatico with U.S. interests in the area?
Well, I wouldn't put, I don't know yet. It's early for Piñera in Chile. We don't know yet who's going to be elected in the upcoming Colombian election. We don't know who's going to be elected in the Brazilian election. I think it's in October this year. I mean, actually, the pendulum in Latin America recently has swung more to the center, and you do have somewhat more right-of-center governments, but you also have, you now have it split between democratic governments that are left-of-center and right-of-center. And so the funny thing about it is that their economic and their social policies are not all that different in terms of the leftist Democrats and the rightist Democrats.
We've got 2 minutes left here, Susan. I want to do one more thing with you, and that is talk once more about Lula da Silva, who is allegedly, depending on who you read, desirous of getting the Nobel Peace Prize because he thinks he can get a deal with Iran to back off developing nuclear warheads, or he wants a role on the Security Council. How much stock are you putting in either one of those two, I guess, rumors that are out there right now?
I don't think anybody's going to get an agreement with Iran to stop developing a nuclear capability. I just don't see it. It's fine if he wanted to try, I suppose, unless, as a result, a lot of people think he made it harder for the UN to adopt sanctions and just gave Iran more time, but that's another issue. In terms of a seat on the UN Security Council, it's very interesting. The main obstacles to that, it's not the United States, it's other countries on the Security Council that have higher priorities than putting Brazil on. And it's a package deal whereby Brazil would go on with some other countries. I don't remember which they are, but I do know that of the 5 countries that are on the Security Council, several of them don't want some of the countries that are in this package on. And even in Latin America, I mean, this goes back several years. Brazil's wanted a seat on the Security Council for a while, and one of the main opponents is Argentina.
And in our last minute, Lula and Chavez. How are they getting on these days?
Oh, they're getting on pretty well. I mean, I think that Lula's approach to foreign policy is to be friends with everybody. And I think in the result, he doesn't seem to take responsibility for very much. It's a leadership that seeks to build consensus, not necessarily to achieve certain things or short-circuit certain big problems or crises.
Susan, it's always good of you to join us on TVO. Thanks so much, and be well down there in Miami Beach, Florida.
Thank you, and enjoy your warm weather.
Thank you.